The Soviets accomplished a great deal while reconquering the territories occupied by the Nazis in Operation Barbarossa and ultimately driving them back to Berlin, where they finally planted the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. However, many myths exist surrounding the Soviet Union and the Red Army, downplaying their involvement in the Second World War. The vast majority of these myths try to portray the Soviet Union in a bad light, or, while acknowledging some of its accomplishments, try to diminish its contribution toward Allied victory and the hard-earned glory its soldiers paid for in blood. In spite of their immense contribution, it's not untrue that Russians, and Soviets in general, are portrayed as caricaturesque and rough-edged, if not outright demonized by most Western media.
I must break you.
And although anti-Soviet sentiment would not be openly expressed during World War II, it would resume right afterwards. Obviously, there was the ideological rivalry between the liberal democracies of the West and the Soviet Union, which was trying to institutionalize and export its communist ideals. But this rivalry ran far deeper, to the point of open antagonism, as the Western powers, including the United States and even Australia and Canada, had fought the Red Army in the past, namely in the Russian Civil War, after the new Bolshevik government of Russia withdrew from World War I. That's why analysing the interwar period is important when trying to understand the events which unfolded in World War II. In this video, we're going to shed some light on some of the myths of the Soviet Union by doing just that.
Is it vodka?
Yeah.
Are you Russian?
Yeah.
The first myth we're going to analyze is that all Soviet officers shot their own soldiers in the back if they retreated or tried to flee. Although the Red Army did have a history of using barrier troops or blocking units to prevent soldiers from deserting or retreating without authorization, the practice of shooting their own soldier hardly ever happened. In 1918, Leon Trotsky, who was the People's Commissar of Military and Naval Affairs at the time, allegedly ordered Mikhail Tukhachevsky, commander of the First Army, to station barrier troops behind unreliable Red Army infantry regiments with orders to shoot them if they tried to desert or retreat. In the same year, Trotsky commissioned additional barrier troops for attachment to each infantry formation in the Red Army, saying, "It is absolutely essential that we have at least an embryonic network of blocking units and that we work out a procedure for bringing them up to strength and deploying them." However, this was during the Russian Civil War, and the practice of shooting their own men in the back did not become even remotely common. The concept of barrier troops was reintroduced on a large scale again in World War II as a countermeasure to reports of units disintegrating in battle and high desertion rates. The People's Commissariat of Defense issued a directive establishing mobile barrier troops composed of People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs personnel tasked with guarding roads, rail stations and forest, and catching deserters and suspicious people. Later, with the deterioration of the situation during the German offensive of 1941, the barrier troops were used once again, tasked with preventing the unauthorized withdrawal of Red Army troops from the front line. According to a letter sent to Stalin's Commissar for Internal Affairs, Lavrenti Beria, from the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 to December of the same year, only 1.5% of the soldiers that were detained by the barrier troops were sentenced to death. Barrier troops had detained 657,364 servicemen during this time. Of the detainees, 632,486 were reformed into units and sent back to the front, while 25,878 were arrested. Ultimately, only 10,201 were sentenced to death and shot. In July 1942, with Order Number 227, Stalin introduced a harsh no-retreat policy with the slogan, "Not one step back," which was popularized in the war. Order Number 227 explicitly stipulated that barrier troops were to shoot panic-mongers and cowards to avoid unauthorized withdrawals. Again, the practice of shooting their own men in the back was not as widespread as many believe, as many officers would rather send the soldiers back into the front than shoot them down. After all, they were in need of as many men as they could get. According to an internal list of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs dated October 1942, Approximately 15,649 soldiers were detained by barrier troops while fleeing the front line of Stalingrad from August 1st, 1942 to October 15th, 1942. Of these, 14,833 were returned to their units, 244 were imprisoned, 218 were sent to penal companies, and 42 to penal battalions, while only 278 were actually shot. By October 1942, barrier troops were used less and less, as the balance of the war slowly turned in the USSR's favour. Finally, by October 1944, barrier troops were officially disbanded by Stalin's Order Number 349. The next myth that we're going to analyse is that the Red Army was quantity over quality. German generals and propaganda started the myth that German soldiers fought against hordes of Soviet troops which came in red waves. This, however, just was not true. By the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the Soviets had 2,680,000 soldiers stationed on its provinces west of the Urals, while the Germans attacked with a force of 3,767,000. The rest of the Soviet forces were stationed in its far east provinces. The balance of forces started to shift in the Soviets' favour from December 1941 onwards, with the arrival of Soviet reinforcements and heavy German losses. With the arrival of said reinforcements, the Soviet army managed to maintain its size, while the Germans just couldn't replace their lost soldiers and started to slowly lose ground. It's true that by 1941, the Soviet Union fielded the largest land and air force in the world. Nevertheless, this alone would not deter Hitler's publicly announced plan to invade and colonize Eastern Europe. Although the Soviet Union boasted the largest air force, it was completely unprepared for the war. The Soviets had invested most of their money on long-range bomber planes, and their fighters were obsolete and unable to engage the much more modern Luftwaffe aircraft. This allowed for the Luftwaffe to virtually annihilate the Soviet Air Force during the first few days of Operation Barbarossa. According to the Luftwaffe's reports, over 2,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed in the first day, while over 3,100 were destroyed in the first 3 days. On the other hand, a Soviet document recorded the loss of 3,922 Soviet aircraft in the first 3 days. This secured the Third Reich's air superiority over the whole European theatre. It also allowed the Luftwaffe to uncontestedly support the Wehrmacht advance with air raids on artillery positions, communication centres, and supply and weapons depots. Another reason why Operation Barbarossa was so devastating for the Soviet Union was the fact that the Soviet Union and its military had just gone through a purge. Of the 5 original marshals of the USSR, only 2 remained in service. This should give you a solid idea of the state the Red Army was in when Operation Barbarossa was launched in June 1941. Almost all of the Red Army's command lines had been replaced. Not only this, but valuable veteran officers were also purged from the military in favour of inexperienced ones, chosen for political reasons rather than experience or qualifications. This completely crippled the Red Army's decision-making abilities and ability to pass on orders and carry out commands. However, the more than capable Soviet soldiers fought with tooth and nail to hold on to their homelands for as long as they could while awaiting reinforcements from the Russian Far East. Unlike many Western armies, the Red Army did not train elite units. The Soviet government had abolished elite units from their army, namely the Imperial Guard, as they were reminiscent of the aristocratic ways of Imperial Russia. The Red Army had also abolished all officer and general ranks and replaced them with a system of positional ranks during the revolution. However, they started to re-adopt officer and general ranks in 1935. Similarly, Guard units re-emerged in 1941, in the wake of Hitler's nasty surprise. Named after the Imperial Guard, Guard units did not receive any special training, although they did get better equipment. Instead, Guard status was an honorific title bestowed upon units that had proven their bravery and ferocity in previous battles. Their name was the only thing that the Red Army's Guard units and Imperial Russia's Imperial Guard had in common. Guard units were like any other units, and their status was due to their merit, not their social class. In the end, it would be Soviet soldiers' bravery and determination in defending their homes, coupled with good logistics, that finally gave the USSR the upper hand. By December of 1941, the Soviet Union had mustered an army of around 1.1 million men, giving them a slight numerical advantage over the Germans. Then a war of attrition started, and the Soviets took advantage of the harsh winter conditions. The Soviet counterattack finally ended the Third Reich's hope of conquering Moscow and gaining a rapid victory, just like they had against the French. As usual, we saved what we considered to be one of the biggest myths about the Soviet Union for last, that the Soviet Union had an early alliance with the Third Reich. And though there is some truth to the foundations on which this myth is based, there was never an actual alliance between these two states. Their relations were always rather tense, and they viewed themselves as competing economies at best, and as each other's ideological, if not actual nemesis at the very worst. Actually, even before the Soviet Union entered World War II, the two countries had already been not only ideologically opposed, but materially opposed as well, as they both supported different parties in the Spanish Civil War. The Soviets sided with the Second Spanish Republic forces, while the Third Reich sided with Francisco Franco's nationalist forces. The Third Reich provided air support to the nationalist forces, support that was instrumental in Franco's eventual victory over Republican forces. This myth mainly revolves around the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, officially known as the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This is what the treaty actually was. A non-aggression treaty. It stipulated that no signatory party would attack the other, nor ally itself with or aid an enemy of the other. However, as it would be revealed during the Nuremberg trials, the pact contained a secret clause through which Germany and the Soviet Union divided Eastern Europe between German and Soviet spheres of influence. What this means is that they drew a map detailing in which direction each state could expand without harming the other's declared interests. The Soviet Union is indeed guilty of both appeasing the Nazis' expansionist ambitions and benefiting from them by annexing parts of Poland. However, the rest of the European powers, and even Poland itself, are guilty of the same sin. Poland had in fact similarly signed a non-aggression pact with Germany back in 1935, and in the aftermath of the signing of the Munich Agreement, otherwise known as the Munich Betrayal, when Hitler decided that the Sudetenland was not enough and took control of the whole country, the Polish decided to have their piece of the pie and grab Solzy for themselves. So after diffusing these common myths about the Soviet Union during World War II, we want to know what you think. Do you regard the Soviets a little bit differently now? Do you see them in a different light? Let us know in the comment section below. And just before you guys go, please do check out the description below where you can find us on various social media platforms where you'll get access to exclusive content that you won't find on this channel. We have our Instagram and Facebook down there, and we also have our Discord if you want to chat to myself and other like-minded history buffs. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.